Hello everyone, welcome to the channel Chess Professor. In today's video, I will be explaining you what are openings and I will show you many openings so that you have a variety of options to play in the starting game. So let's start. Basically, the opening are the starting 10 to 12 moves or even more which can give you an advantage in the game so that you will win the game. So I will show you openings not only from the white side but also from the black side. So first let's see the common options of white with e4 and then d4. Starting with so when you play the e4 is called the king's pawn. So when you play e4 as the first move, you are playing the king's pawn opening. So now let's suppose the black plays the most common move e5. Then you have a variety of options like knight to f3, bishop to c4. This you even have gambits like the King's Gambit, the Danish Gambit, and so more. But first, let me tell you the four knights game. It is when you play knight to f3, your opponent defends this pawn which you have attacked. Then you play your other knight and your opponent does the same thing. Now you have entered the four knights game. In the four knights game, you have a variety of options. I will show you the three most common options, which are the Italian variation, in which you play bishop to c4, bishop to c4, the Roy Lopez or the Spanish variation, in which you play bishop to b5, and the last the Halloween gambit. This is one of the gambits for white. So starting with the four nights Italian variation. This is maybe one of the worst variations you can play with the four nights game because your opponent can capture this pawn. If you recapture, your opponent will play d5, four king, two pieces. Even if you capture this piece, now your opponent has a center pawn and you do not, and your opponent is in a better position than you. So next comes the Roy Lopez or the Spanish variation. In this variation, you threaten this knight, so that means that your opponent have to defend this pawn, or you will just or you will just capture the horse. Your opponent recaptures, and you just got a free pawn. Free pawn, as now this pawn will not be defended. This is also a good variation, but let me tell you one better variation. This is the Halloween Gambit. The Halloween Gambit is maybe the best you can play as a beginner or intermediate player after the four nights game. Your opponent usually captures, then you play d4. Now, either if your opponent plays knight to g3, which is the better move, or knight to c6, sorry, not g3, g6, or knight to c6, which is the most common move, but not very good. Now you just keep pushing your pawns. Keep pushing your keep pushing your pawns. Now if you see, you have gotten a space advantage. All your opponent's pieces are just at the bank rack, and the knight can't do anything. Literally, there is one developed piece which literally does nothing. Now let's suppose after this move, instead of playing the second knight and entering the three knights or the four knights game, you play bishop to c4. This is known as the Italian game. Now I will explain you Italian game in some different variations, as the Italian game has maybe the most variations, even though it is the most easiest. So now the most common move is bishop to c5. Now you can go with the Ivan's gambit, which is pawn to b4, where you sacrifice one pawn to just getting a strong center. mm, For getting a strong center, castling, and then now you. So this is the Ivan's gambit. After this, instead of playing the Ivan's gambit, you can play the Gucci piano, in which you are preparing to play d4. And let's suppose after you play this, your opponent plays any move, knight to f6. You just play pawn to d4, which is the Gucci piano. Here, if you play pawn to d3, protecting this pawn, this is known as the Guki Piani Game. I don't know the pronunciation. You will see the name. Now let's suppose your opponent, instead of playing bishop to c5, plays this move. Now you have entered the two knights defense. Now you have various options like playing normal moves, developing, castling, but you have a better option which is known as the fried liver attack, where you attack this pawn. The most common move is d4. You capture, your opponent captures, you sacrifice a knight, give a queen check, and then you play this move. Now your opponent has to defend with this move, this queen move. Sorry, not this queen move, this queen move, or else if they prevent with this queen move, you just capture the knight and just get an free rook. Now you are in a better position as you have seven more points of material. Then black. Now here, instead of playing the Italian game, you can play bishop to b5, known as the Roy Lopez game, where you attack this knight, and if your opponent captures, you just get a free pawn. This is an very amazing opening, but as it has many lines and theory, I recommend to not learn it if you are a beginner or intermediate player. If you are a 16-1800 player, you can you can learn this opening, as this is a very strong opening and you can easily win many with this. Now let's suppose, instead of playing any bishop move or knight move, you just play pawn to d4. Your opponent usually captures and you capture your pawn back. Now you have entered the Scotch game. In this also, your opponent has many options like capturing your knight, attacking with the bishop, doing this, and many. Now, instead of taking your pawn back, you just move your bishop to c4. This is known as the Scotch gambit. If your opponent plays any other move, it is the Scotch gambit. But if your opponent plays the move bishop to c5, this is now known as the Haxo gambit. Even though maybe both are the same gambits, just the name has changed because the move has changed. Now let's suppose, instead of playing any of these, you just play bishop pawn to c3. Now you have entered the Ponziani opening. The Ponziani opening is a very strong opening, but this is also like the Royal Lopez or something else, a opening which has many variations. Like if your opponent plays this knight, you capture, they capture, you capture. So there are many other things. You can even many things. Here your opponent, instead of playing the knight, can play this move. So there are many variations in this. Now let's suppose, instead of even playing knight to c3, you just play sorry, not knight to c3, knight to f3. You just play knight to c3. Now you have entered the Vienna game. Now if your opponent plays knight to f6, you will just play pawn to f4, and now you have entered the Vienna gambit. But instead, if your opponent plays knight to c6, you have now entered the Vienna game Max Lang defense. This you can also say that this is the copycat variation. Now let's suppose your opponent plays e5, and instead of playing any other move, you just play uh, pawn to f4 immediately without this move, knight to c3. Then now you have entered the king's gambit. Your opponent will usually capture, and you'll play this knight move so that you can prevent this queen check. Now instead of playing all these, you just play pawn to d4. Then you sacrifice another pawn. You move your bishop. Your opponent usually captures another pawn. Now you capture the pawn. Now you have entered the game of Danish Gambit. This that you have entered the game of the Danish Gambit. In the Danish Gambit, you have two strong angry bishops, and they can easily checkmate your opponent very easily. Now, if your opponent makes a mistake, you can just go for the scholar's mate, or even if your opponent plays the right move, which is this bishop check. You just defend with the knight. If your opponent captures, you recapture, and now you are attacking this weak pawn, which now attacks the rook. And there is no way to defend instead of this knight, except of this knight move. But you can easily kick away the knight with this move, or even these two pawn moves. This move is much better, of course. So this is the Danish gambit. Now now let me tell you the bishop's opening. Bishop's opening is maybe one of the most aggressive openings, especially if your opponent plays knight to f6, as you can enter this gambit. As you can enter in this gambit, which is very strong, unbelievably. Now let's suppose you played e4 and your opponent played d4. You have entered the Scandinavian defense. Wait, first let me tell you some black openings, because the rest openings are just related to black's move. So now your opponent played e4. You can move in very ways like this: pawn to e6, which is the French defense. You, you oh sorry, not e5, pawn to e6. Now usually your opponent will capture the whole center, and you play pawn to d4, challenging the center. The most common variation is advanced variation. You move your this pawn so that if your opponent captures, you capture with the bishop and get free development. This opening is strong, but now your white bishop is trapped and can't develop. It can just develop at this square, which is bishop to d7. Except this is a very strong opening, and you can learn it. Next comes uh, next comes the perk defense. When you play pawn to d6, your opponent usually takes the whole center. You play this move, knight to f6. Now this is like the king's Indian defense, in which you move your pawn here, bishop, castle, but instead your opponent have just played e4 and you have played d6. I will explain you the king's Indian later when we'll talk about the d4 move. Now, instead of playing this, you can play d5. This is known as a Scandinavian defense, which I was talking earlier. Your opponent capture, you can either recapture, enter the main line, or play this move and enter the modern variation. I would recommend this move more, as you are usually a beginner, and for beginners, this move is much better. Now you have entered the main line. Next, after the Scandinavian defense, let's suppose you played pawn to c6. Now you have entered the Caro-Kann defense. Your opponent usually takes the whole center, and you play d5, immediately challenging the center. Most common move, you play this move. My next video will be about the strong Caro-Kann defense. So please like and sub if you want this video. Now next comes pawn to c5. This is maybe the worst option for beginner and intermediate players against e4. This is the Sicilian defense. This is the worst option because of the theory it has. Your opponent literally has a million moves. This move you enter the Alpine Sicilian. This move you enter the Mengari variation. This move is the closed Sicilian. This move is the open Sicilian. Your opponent can play something like this. This is the Smith Mora gambit. So there are a total of 1 million options your opponent can play. Even this is even this is also an variation in which your opponent just takes you out of theory, and you have to play pawn to e4. It is like your necessity to play pawn to e4, or else you will just be out of theory all the time and you won't know what moves to play and what to not. So after, you can also play pawn to e4. You play e5. Your opponent plays this move. Now instead of playing this move, you just play this knight to f6. This is known as the Petrov defense. Your opponent captures. You can do something like this, or even recapture the pawn, etc., etc. Next comes your opponent plays this move and you play this. This is the fill order defense. This is also an very strong opening. Usually your opponent plays d4, but you counter attack with this move. Now next, let's suppose you played the normal move. Your opponent played the Italian. Now here you can play this move and you enter the Rossi gambit. The Rossi Gambit is maybe one of the best gambits against the Italian game. Your opponent captures, you play this move or whatsoever. Now let's suppose you played the normal moves. Your opponent plays the Roy Lopez opening. You can go with the same, and this is now the Janis Gambit. And if not accepted, the Skimile defense. This is also a good opening. Maybe not the best opening against the Roy Lopez, but you can still play it if you are a intermediate player. Because usually in beginner games you won't get the Roy Lopez from your opponent. Now here instead of playing d6 and entering the Perk defense, you can play this move knight to f6 and enter the Alkaline's defense. The most common move is this. You you move your knight once more. Now your opponent can play this move, like the Sicilian, a total of 1000 million literal moves. And I also don't recommend this opening, not even if you are an 16 1800, because you have to move your knight so many times that just see, you have literally moved your knight one, two, three, four times just now in one variation of the alkaline defense. Now let's suppose you played e5, your opponent plays this move. Now you play pawn to f5. This is known as the Latvian gambit. This is also not very good, especially for beginners. The most common move is to capture, you recapture. If your opponent if your opponent pins the pawn, you unpin the pawn. If your opponent plays something like this, you play this. Now you attack the knight and the bishop. Sorry, not this move. This move first. Now your opponent just say, let's play this. You have now your opponent takes back your knight and another. You have got this position. Your opponent can also play this move, but but the Latvian gambit is like not very good black, as usually your opponent will develop his or her pieces, and you will just keep attacking. Now next comes, you just enter the Italian game and you enter the two knights defense. Instead of playing the Rusi gambit, which is the best gambit, you enter the two knights defense. Your opponent played this move. This is known as the Fred lever. You just play your bishop to c5 now. Why now? Because this is the fractional counter attack. Let's suppose your opponent captured you, just sacrifice your bishop. This king to e2, and this is just check, 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 uh, check, check, and then mate. So this is the fractional counter attack. So this is the most common variation. This is one of the variations. Now let's move on. Let's move on to the openings which I was thinking to teach you. after the Scandinavian defense, you play your knight. Your opponent captures, you capture. Now you have entered the tension gambit. Your opponent will usually play this move. Then you give one more pawn. Your opponent captures, you also capture. Now usually your opponent will play pawn to h6. Now capture with sacrifice your knight, sacrifice your bishop, and just get a free queen. Easy peasy. Now let's enter. You can now play d4. So after d4, let's suppose your opponent plays d5. Now you can play the London system, which comes after bishop to f4. Maybe the best opening for beginners, as it is the easiest to learn. With almost the same setup, you push your pawn. You you just you just push your knight, pawn, bishop, this castle, king side. If your bishop is attacked with this bishop, you just come back so that now your pawn is protecting your bishop, and if it is ever captured, you just move and get an open file. So this is maybe the for white if you are a beginner. Next comes the queen's gambit. This is a very strong opening. The queen, sorry, not the king's, the queen's gambit. This is a very very strong opening known as the queen's gambit. Your opponent usually your opponent plays this. You can just play this move. Your opponent plays something, you pin the knight, something like this. And if your opponent accepts, you have just gotten the whole center. And now your opponent can't do nothing about it. Even if he plays any of the knights, she is just hopeless. You can also get your pawn back with the bishop. Now you play d4. Your opponent plays d5. You play this move. This is known as the Cole system. I do not like this system, not gonna lie, because now your bishop is just trapped. This is the same as the London system. Just your bishop is trapped. Now after that, uh, let's suppose you played this. Now you can play the Catalan opening, where you are preparing to fianchetto your bishop, so that your bishop has this long diagonal and your bishop is now a strong door. This usually comes after the queen's gambit declined. The Catalan opening. This is not a very good opening, especially for beginner to intermediate players. Even though usually advanced players play this because it has a maybe the most theory after an d4. Now let me tell you what you can do against d4 if you are black. Now your opponent plays d4, you can play d5. If your opponent goes for the queen's gambit, you can play the queen's gambit declined or the Slav defense. The queen's gambit declined is a better variation. There is also one more variation known as the Albin counter gambit. This is the best you can play after the queen's gambit if you are a beginner to intermediate player. Now, instead of playing d5, you can play this move, pawn to f5. Now you have entered the Dutch defense. You have to now fianchetto your bishop, castle, put your knight to f6, etc., etc. Now you can also play this move, knight to f6. Now you have entered the Indian game. Now let me tell you many of the Indian variations. Starting with the most common and the best Indian variation known as the King's Indian. Your opponent plays some random move, you just play this. You if your opponent plays e4, you just play d6. This, this. Any random move, you just castle. Now your king is safe and is protected by the bishop. Your opponent can't do nothing about it, and you'll just move your knight and push pawns in the king side and have a king side attack. Then comes the Queen's Indian defense, in which you play this move. This is known as the Queen's Indian defense. In this, you usually prepare to fianchetto your bishop and place your bishop here and castle. This time, your king is protected with the pawns, and your queen's bishop is fianchettoed. Next comes this. This is the Nimzo Indian defense, in which you just pin your knight, pin the opponent's knight. Now let's suppose instead of this move, your opponent plays this. Now you give a check. Your opponent usually defends with your knight. Even if he doesn't, you have just entered the Bogo Indian defense. Your opponent does this, you just trade. And you have gotten better position, as now your opponent has doubled pawns. So now let me also tell you some of the gambits. Your opponent played c4, you played pawn to e4. This now you have entered the Budapest gambits. I will not show you many gambits, as I have already shown you some with e4, and usually you will get more e4 than d4. And even if you get d4, you usually play the King's Indian defense or the Nimzo Indian defense. Now let me show you flank openings. Flank openings are the openings in which you play any other move instead of e4 and d4. So starting with the flank openings, the English opening in which you play pawn to c4. This is a very strong opening, but as usual, this is an opening with a lot of fury. You usually fianchetto both your bishops and castle kingside. Next comes the bird opening. Bird's opening. This is the worst opening of all time if you like flank openings, because your opponent can just play the King's Indian as usual, and you can, even though you can play somewhat like the English, but now even if your opponent doesn't play the King's Indian, he can play something like this, even though he is sacrificing the pawn. But now, see, your king side is your this diagonal, dark side diagonal is very weak, and it can be easily attacked with somewhat like bishop, or even something like this, where the opponent's queen is here. The knight is some the knight the knight is also somewhere. You have given check. Your rook is threatened, and some many things. So after this comes the Hungarian. This is when you just go for the fianchetto way, so that you fianchetto your bishop, your light squared bishop or the queen side bishop. This is also known as the king's fianchetto opening or the Hungarian opening. Next, next Next and the last opening for the day is the King's Indian attack. In this, you just play the normal King's Indian as you play in the black. Just the difference is that you are playing, that you are just playing it with the white, and you have an extra move. Also, if you do not play the King's Indian attack after this opening is known as the ready opening, as you have moved your knight as the first option. Now this is all for today. I hope you like this video. You can check any of these openings and try to learn them. This is all for today's video. Please like and subscribe. Bye.